good. We got four. All right, any agenda revisions?
Spoke with Red about talking about the Western Regional Partnership Steering Committee. Were you going to bring that up in your?
I would, yep.
You were going to bring something up? I have some comment I'd like to make when Brett brings up that stuff, so don't have to change anything.
All right. If you will look under item 6, under C, approval of partners' policy and procedures. Actually, 1, 2, and 3 on those. So I should pull those and send those back to the staff to review.
All three of them.
All 3 of them.
So item C is basically all in item C.
All right, hearing no other citizen recognition. Take this time to allow 5 minutes for citizen recognition. We do have somebody tonight, Ms. Mary Short. For you.
Hello, my name is Mary Short, and I live in Taylorsville in Alexander County, but I come here to these meetings to make public comments and to record your meetings. And just for the fun of it, I thought y'all should know. I have an email list of about 200 families. We are mostly severe and profound individuals. And I sent out the link to not last month, the month before, board meeting, to my 200 families, and they of course sent it out to other families. But I was pleased to see that your board meeting received 78 hits, which is a pretty good number considering my email list is across all of North Carolina, mostly centered in the Smoky and Mecklenburg. So you did really well for your first time being posted on YouTube. Second of all, I sent out last month a request to all of the LME MCOs information about their IDD population, a request for information about their IDD population. Smoky has a fabulous little chart that they put out every month, and it talks about a bunch of things regarding the IDD population, but it specifically addresses relative as direct service employee. And I, so far, only received a response from Sand Hills. To give you a baseline, on the old CAP MRDD waiver, home supports was the only service parents were allowed to provide. In the entire state, there were 1,091 of us. So far, in my request for information from the LME MCOs, between Smoky and Sand Hills, there are 600 relative as direct service employees. So it sort of makes me wonder why everybody is so anxious about relatives being paid service providers. If under the old waiver there were just over 1,000 of us in the whole state, and now I have numbers between just 2 LME MCOs, there are 600 of us, I just don't understand why everybody is so panic-stricken that there's some huge increase in relatives as service providers, service workers. Second thing, I received a provider alert email, and in this provider alert, it talks about a reminder about relatives as direct service employees. And I am upset about the wording in this provider alert because it says, by law, caregivers can serve blah, blah, blah in unique and exceptional circumstances. Nowhere in the waiver or the clinical policy does it use the words unique or exceptional circumstances. I am completely offended and hope you will change that wording at some point. Also, as I have been investigating, looking around, trying to figure out what's happening at the federal level, I found a group called the National Consumer Voice. And this group was originally formed for individuals and their family members and their legal guardians who were in nursing homes. But they now have a special section devoted specifically to home and community-based service waiver recipients. When I attended the partners training to the service providers about relative as direct support employees, I heard the gentleman who approves all of the applications. It's no longer a committee, it's just one man, in case y'all didn't know that. He said some really extraordinary things and offensive things. So I wanted to read something from this Consumer Voice group who is working to change national policy. So one of the things the Consumer Voice and Home and Community-Based Services have asked for on a national level policy change is that there be policies that require that consumers have the right to choose their workers and schedules for care and services. Consumers were very clear that they wanted a say in who their worker is and when their services are provided. These choices are fundamental to person-centered care. Allowing consumers the choices in these areas makes care and services more responsive to consumer needs and improves not only quality of care, but quality of life as well. Without these choices, we are in essence, quote, institutionalizing, end quote, people in their own homes. So as you look at who is being approved and disapproved, and you look at the justification that is required when families, guardians, consumers tell you it's not a good fit, you need to ask yourself whether by not allowing that simple choice, this potential worker is not a good fit. If you do not allow us to make those choices, have you decided to institutionalize the beneficiary consumer in their own home? Thank you.
Thank you, George. Moving on to the consent agenda. I've gotten a copy of the minutes from the last meeting on there. Entertain a motion to accept those if there are no changes.
Motion to approve.
Second. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Carries. Moving on to 5, reports. Finance Committee.
Okay, Mr. Chair, thank you very much. The Finance Committee did meet last week, Thursday last week, in Hickory.
Yeah.
In attendance were myself, David Eisenhower, Barbara Anderson, Bill Purchase, Mr. Tate, Matt Call, Frank Zachary, and of course Neil and Susan Rakich joined us. I want to welcome some new members for this year. Pam Poteet has joined us, David Eisenhower, Frank Zachary, and Barbara Anderson. And that's a good little compliment of people who work with us, and I appreciate very much them being on there. Now, even though Commissioner Klein is not here tonight, I don't see him, I owe him a bit of a public apology. Because he was not on the initial Finance Committee list, and he was a very dedicated member of that group for the last couple of years. The last time I spoke with him, he had said he was rolling off the board. But that doesn't happen until the end of this calendar year. So Mr. Klein is also on the Finance Committee, and I just want to make my little public apology, and if y'all see him, you can pass it on to him. We did meet, we did go over the financial reports for the last, effectively for the fiscal year end on June 30th. Those are on page 7 and 8 for you to look at. We'll entertain some questions later on if you have some for me to answer. But I'm just going to hot spot real quickly. We did end up the year in a strong position. Our revenues exceeded our expenditures. We were there. Our balance sheet's in good shape. Mr. Purchase always references 2 items that are indicative of that. Our current ratio is 4.23 to 1. The state of North Carolina minimum criteria is 1 to 1. So we're good in that shape. Our defensive ratio, which effectively is how much cash we have if we have some real catastrophes, is 63 days of cash on hand. The minimum standard is 30. So we ended up at the year very fine, in a strong balance sheet, a strong position, and we'll need to have that as we go forward as this industry changes and the model that we're in changes. And I'm just as an aside, I'm very proud of where we are. When we get down to it, we've only been at this a year and a half, or 2 years or so, I think, something like that, as a first MCO.
Yeah.
So, we did end up very well. A couple of things that staff is looking at, our Medicare medical expense ratio is running about 90%, and we prefer about 95%. Staff is looking into that. To improve that, get closer to what our standards should be, what we think it should be. Our IPRS medical expense ratio has been running a bit over 100%. Over the last several months, that's been correcting downward as it should. So they're working on that. Another thing we discussed in our meeting was the Medicaid penetration rate, which is about 15% overall. And according to Niels and Susan, who have looked at Colorado that has a similar waiver, 15% feels kind of good. However, when you drill down further, there are some counties where we have a much lower penetration rate. And so those matters need to be looked into too, because it's highly unlikely that those counties, fewer people need our services, the services of mental health. So those are two drill down areas that came out of the meeting that we're working toward there. That recaps the meeting. While we're still on the financial statements, we'll open it up if anybody has any questions about the financial statements.
You just have one, what was the ratio again?
Okay, the current ratio is 4.2 to 1.
4.21.
4.2 to 1. That's close to 1. Okay, that was the recap of the report itself. We do every year, every meeting, have this board approve the prior minutes of the prior finance meeting. Those are on page 6. Okay, just so we all recognize this impacts all of us. So, Chair, I would ask for a motion to approve the finance committee minutes from June 17th that are on page 6.
Yeah.
I guess Bill probably.
Here, you make the motion.
I'll make the motion.
It's directed by the
Okay, I'll make the motion.
All right, coming from the committee needs no second. Any questions or discussion? All in favor, aye. Aye. All opposed?
Thank you very much, and I tell you what, I did step 2 before I did step 1, so we can finish that out. We do have a resolution to go through and approve. It is on pages 8 and 9. And in our meeting, Susan mentioned to us that this resolution is something that we passed last year. It's fairly well standard on down through, but excluding the last paragraph. The last paragraph is a special reallocation or redesignation of $4 million that we had moved from,
Yeah.
we needed help on this, that we had moved from, that we intend to move from fund balance committed MCO Medicaid operations to the normal LME fund balance. Our discussion about this is, I may let Susan speak to it, the only way I can understand it is redesignation of something we did a year ago. A year ago, we were not capitalized with Medicaid, so we capitalized it, I think, from our general fund. And now that we have had some Medicaid experience and have some revenues and excessive expenditures there, we're moving it back.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
So in essence, that is what we're doing. We basically loaned ourselves some money to get started, and now we're moving it back. So, the Finance Committee brings before the board the resolution 2041-0821, coming from the Standing Committee.
All right, we have a motion from the committee. Any other discussion?
Is the stuff that's being redesignated related to the underpayment from the state at all?
I understand that it's also mandatory to be in compliance with the law. Is that correct? Your own policy?
The board needs to approve any movements within the fund balance area mostly. So the board approved us to move this $4 million from basically LME funds that was prior to the Medicaid operations over to create a initial fund balance of $4 million for Medicaid services. And so this is just moving it back from Medicaid back into LME.
Did we get a second?
Any other discussion? All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Got a couple other matters real quickly. Last 2 points very quickly. I'm going to pass this out. And then I'll speak to those last 2 points at the same time. These actually did go out in email, but I asked Niels to go ahead and make some extra copies. While they are coming out, I'll reference that. What is coming around to you is the proposed meeting schedule for the next meeting for this coming year. Okay? You will notice on there that we have several teleconferences, and we also have several face-to-face meetings. I wanted this to come around to make 2 points. The first point is to let you know that in this particular fiscal year, it is time for this board to review and approve our auditors for the next 2 or 3 years. For those of you who are maybe somewhat new, when we merged, well, prior to merger, Pathways and I think one of the other entities was using Larson. Okay? The merger committee, I think there were 2 using Larson.
Yeah.
The merger committee, which was formed to help merge this enterprise, decided to go ahead and stay with Larson Allen because staff had enough on their plate. Even when the merger was completed, say a year and a half ago or so, staff was worn out with their efforts in that. So we made ourselves a promise that we would let the smoke clear and then have a fiduciary responsibility to go ahead and put our audit contracts out for bidding. I want to state that there's nothing at all, no problem from Larson Allen, they were great, etc. But we made ourselves a promise a couple of years ago that from a fiduciary viewpoint, we need to do this, and this is the year we're going to do it. That is also indicated on the bottom of that schedule.
Yeah.
The other reason, and the last reason for passing out this schedule is I would like to just invite any of you that want to come and attend the finance to please do so. You're perfectly welcome. If there's a vote, obviously the committee members only can vote, but you are perfectly welcome to come and participate and get involved in that if you so choose. We'd love to have you. Mr. Perkins, when he was chair, we invited everybody. And that's the place that we dive into the details. Niels and Susan give us dashboard reports, paper about that thick. Okay? It shows where they drill down and what they're doing. So anyone who would like to come, please feel free to do it. We'd love to have you. And, okay, I think that's it. Talked about the auditor, invited everybody to the meetings, and we got the resolution. Mr. Chair, that's all.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you for all that work, a lot of input there, and scheduling stuff too. Appreciate the invite. Turn it over now to our CFAC report with Pam.
We had our CFAC meeting at the Statesville Library, August 13th, and Paul Caldwell was our presenter, and he presented the summary of gaps, and we had discussion on strategies possibly to address those, and noticed a lot of variation in the different counties. Very interesting. The CFAC really enjoyed that information. We also are working on our strategic plan, and we'll have that finalized and we'll get a copy to you soon, hopefully by the end of September. We have a celebration. Dean Hoggins has been elected as state chair of the state CFAC call, which is every 2 months and involves all of the CFACs across the state, and he is chair of that call. Very proud of his leadership. And those are for the main highlights.
Thank you. Congratulations again. on to C, to our CEO report from President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just several things I want to update you on. I think when we met in June at our last meeting, we talked about where the House was in terms of legislation that might impact us as an MCO. And at the time, there was a House Bill 1181, which was the House attempt to reform or make some modifications to the Medicaid system. And as we talked about that during the June meeting, it did go pretty much in line with what we thought, where we thought we were headed. It's fairly much in sync with what the governor and secretary's plan had been in terms of moving towards the regions that we talked about, with the goal to ultimately capitate the physical medicine side to get those costs in line. I think I mentioned to you in that proposed legislation, there were some demonstration projects that were in there that would allow some co-management from us as an MCO, or from one MCO that would be successful in being a demonstration project, to manage both the behavioral health dollars as well as the physical dollars for a targeted population. So that's kind of where we left it. And I think when we talked in June, we thought that may not go anywhere during this short session. There was an eagerness on the part of the members to get back to their home counties. And then shortly after that, the House did obviously pass that version, and it went over to the Senate. And the Senate took up House Bill 1181 and really did and voted through their version of a House Bill 1181, but they don't look alike. There's dramatic differences between the Senate version and the House version. The Senate version was not as concrete in the role that the MCOs that we would play. It was much more of a model that would potentially allow for out-of-state or outside managed care companies to come in and manage not only the physical medicine piece, but also the behavioral health piece. It also had a provision where the Senate was going to establish a new kind of division that would manage the Medicaid benefits. The Medicaid benefits would be pulled out of the Department of Health and Human Services and put into this new division, if you will, that would have board members assigned, that would be paid board members that would sit on that committee. So that made its way through the Senate, and it was passed. We advocated with the Senate that we preferred the House version. The House version really built off of the current model, the current success that we believe that we've been able to demonstrate. And we advocated for the Senate to take that, the House version as it related to us, and carve that into their legislation. And they didn't do that, and they passed their version of House Bill 1181. So that left it, a difference between the two, and they did not tackle that, or they did not come to any consensus between the two houses. The confusion that exists out there now is whether or not they're going to come back in November and tackle that issue. There was a desire, particularly on the part of the Senate, I believe, to come back into session before the normal session would kick back in January to address Medicaid reform. The House adjourned this week and didn't put that in their adjourning resolution that they were coming back. So there is mention of it in the budget bill that mentions it's the intent that for the legislature to come back, but I'm unclear and don't know the exact answer whether or not that means they come back or it's their intent, but they can still only come back if called by the governor. So there's a question of whether or not this will be addressed in an interim special called session, or this will come back. But there's two views now of reform, one the House version and one the Senate version. There's dramatic differences between the two, and so that will get reconciled at some point. Again, our position has continued to be that we believe very strongly that we have been very successful. As Steve mentioned earlier, we've been at this now a year and a half as an MCO, and we feel very good about the success that we've had. And we feel that we've got the foundation to now transfer that to the new phase of managed care implementation. As we talked at the board level a couple months ago, that means outcomes, and turn the system towards consumer outcomes and provider outcomes, and that kind of being our focus as we move forward. We feel that we've made the system more accessible to consumers. We have controlled the cost within our area of responsibility, and we're working towards integrated care. And those, if you look at the governor's desires, if you look at the Senate desires, you look at the House, those are kind of the core 4 or 5 benchmarks that all the different plans say, and we think that we can successfully show where we're meeting all those. So that's what we'll continue to do, whether it be between now and November or between now and January. We'll continue to advocate and demonstrate where we believe that we're meeting the objectives of all the different competing plans. With the session that did end, the one thing that really impacted us is there is an administrative cut in our funding. You'll remember that we get administrative dollars paid to us from our Medicaid capitation rate, and then we also get administrative dollars paid to us from our state funds. And the administrative dollars that we will get as a state were cut in budget about $1.8 million, I believe, was the statewide number. So part of that will trickle down to us, and we'll have an administrative reduction in our LME state-operated service fund. We don't know the exact amount. We haven't gotten our final allocation yet for state funding, but that'll impact us, and we'll have to respond to that to get the final number. One of the things that is in the, as it will relate to us, but it directly relates to the Department of Health and Human Services, there's a lot of additional reporting requirements in the legislation that was just passed. A lot of data that has been put into statute now that will have to be reported. And so that obviously will impact us, that we'll have to make sure that the Department of Health and Human Services has data from our operations to feed into their reports that are now required to be reported to the legislature, so that we just know that that's coming. That'll be some additional administrative burden to make sure that those reports are prepared, but that's kind of the nature of what goes on. Another statewide issue, just to let you know, we have been notified, Niels and Susan and I, that we have our preliminary, the rate setting process happens in 2 parts. They kind of come together and they look at what's called the data book, what the numbers have been historically, and then we talk about that and talk about what's in there, what's not in there, and some things that might not be accurately reflected in those numbers. And that then is followed up a couple months later with an actual rate-setting meeting. So our data book meeting has been set, and we'll be going down to Raleigh, I don't know the exact date, September the 3rd will be our meeting. So when we meet again, we'll be able to report to you how that meeting has gone, and then again, that will then follow with a meeting after that to actually get our rate offer from the department. So that's kind of the statewide picture. If we drill down from there and talk about the Western Regional Partnership position, if things continue to progress under the way that we said that we want to push things, we think that right now our focus as a Western Regional Partnership should be on standardizing operations. And we put a lot of effort into making that happen. We continue to put a lot of effort into making that happen. And we think that's the right objective for a couple of reasons. One is we don't know exactly what's going to happen at the legislative level. And while we know the plan, the ultimate plan at least as endorsed by the House, and the plan that we've all supported as individual MCO LMEs, is to get to the 4-region model. And certainly we're prepared to make that move under the time frame that the Secretary originally set out. We can make that happen. But what we probably don't want to do is get too far ahead of that in case the Secretary has a change in how that configuration should happen, or the Senate or the House want to see something slightly different. So we're not pursuing that part of our efforts as aggressively, because we think the real benefit to the consumers and the communities we serve right now is focusing on the standardization side of that. And so as it relates to providers and consumers, the way that we operate in Smoky catchment area and the way that we operate in the Centerpoint catchment area and partners is starting to look a lot more alike. We're finding out things that we're doing together. We're learning from each other. Sometimes it's a 4th way of doing things. We look at the 3 ways that we're currently doing it, and we come up with one that's different from all those 3. Sometimes they're adopting something that we're doing, or vice versa. So there's a lot of good sharing that's going on right now. 2 of the things that are probably most important that group is developing that you'll see happen in the next couple of months are the standardization or the joining together around credentialing of providers. And we've mentioned that in the past, whereas Right now, a provider that wants to do business in our area, or a current provider that wants to add a service in our area, has to do that 3 times if they're in all 3 of our current areas. In order to make that easier for providers, we're joining together to consolidate that effort. So one provider can make application and say, I want to provide this service, I want to do it in all 3 areas, I want to do it in 2 of the 3 or 1 of the 3, and they only have to make that application to be credentialed and reviewed one time. We think that's going to have significant, and we know it's going to have significant benefit because our providers have applauded us for going down that road. They think that's a good move. The other thing that we're working on right now that will be live shortly is to work with each other on our call center. So that when the call volume is high in one of our 3 call center areas, our access department, our customer services department, when the call volume is greater than the staffing, and of course you never know, you can staff based on history, but you never know day to day or hour to hour if that's the right number. So to have call backup, that's going to be implemented so where calls can roll over seamlessly from one location to the other, and calls can be answered, staffed by a licensed clinician, consumers can get access to care, can get appointments scheduled, and not have to have any delay because of peak time within a particular MCO. So that's a positive thing that's going on. So all these things that are happening on the standardization front, again, if you look about, so what's going to happen with merger, these are things that we would have to do anyway when we're merging. So these things really do aid in the eventual merger. So when we're looking at a standardized benefit plan, or we're looking at standardized ways of doing utilization management, that's what we're doing now. So when we get to that final end of saying that it's time to merge, the work really, for the most part, will have been done through the standardization effort that's going on now. So it's a good process and good cooperation amongst the 3 teams. Getting to the question or the point that Bill was asking, we had the board had elected 3 people to serve as your representatives to kind of a joint steering committee, similar to the one that Steve talked about that happened the last time when we were looking at the auditors, and that steering committee had that decision. And so that group met, I think, one time on a conference call, and then a lot of stuff sort of happened at the state. And we kind of tabled that discussion because there wasn't really anything that was moving rapidly related to merger that the boards needed to consider. And so that's still where we're at. Nothing's changed. We've talked about that at the last steering committee that we had as staff, and that there's no need right now to pull that group back together. One of the information I shared with that group, though, is what Bill had brought up is because it's been so long and some of our officer positions have changed, it may make sense for this board to reconsider who their members are on that, because we've gone through different changes that have happened, and our colleagues are doing the same. So we've all agreed, all 3 said that when it gets time to reconstitute that each board will come back together and say, reconstitute it with whoever makes sense for you. If it's the same 3 people, if it's different people, that's certainly up to the individual boards, and the boards have that prerogative to put on that committee at that time whoever they want to have on there. Just a couple of other things to mention too. I reviewed with you at the June meeting the strategic goals that we had set for staff. And what the individual benchmarks that we're going to measure to see if we're achieving those goals. We reviewed that in detail. Neil did at the all-staff meetings that we had with all of our staff over a couple of weeks ago. So those will come back to you. We'll probably have a report sometime in the next couple of months just to, again, refresh your memory on the benchmarks that we're targeting and give you updates at that point about where are we after the first few months of achieving those, and let you know if we think we're moving where we need to be, or if we're having to focus more attention on one or the other. But the staff is excited. The staff knows what the expectations are, and they know that it's a team effort. It's not just one particular department that's driving this. It is 300 plus partners, employees that are driving that together. I mentioned earlier, it's not in our strategic goals, but it is central to what we need to be doing, and that's focusing on integrated care. So you'll have a lot of information that we'll share with you in the coming months about, Partners is going to be launching in a fairly significant way efforts around better integration of care between physical medicine and behavioral health medicine. We do a lot of things now, but a lot of the things that we do are isolated. It's with a particular practice or with a particular group, and we're looking for a more comprehensive 8-county approach to this. You heard Paul talked a few months ago about the hub concept with providers and having some integrated care built into some of those hub concepts. A number of initiatives are kind of going on, so it may be as early as September that we want to just update you as part of maybe the board departmental overview, just to let you know what our concept is around integrated care and where we are and what you might expect to hear about that topic. The other thing that hopefully we'll be able to share with you in September is we're working on what's called our year one summary to kind of highlight what we did during our first year of operation, some of the successes that we had, some of the particular benchmarks that we hit that we're proud of and we think that you as a board will be proud of. So that document's kind of a work in process right now, and a lot of people are gathering information to complete that document, but our goal would be to hopefully be able to bring that and have some discussion about that when we get together at the September meeting. And then the last thing to share with you, I shared by email that David Swan has announced his retirement. He did that in early July. His last day with us will be the end of October. There will be a retirement celebration for him at the Elkin office. I don't remember off the top of my head the date. The date has been set, and I'll get an email out to you, the board, so that anybody that can make it. It'll be similar to what we did here for John's retirement. It'll be over a period of a few hours. It's more of a drop-in thing, so whatever works with your schedule. I'm sure David would love to see as many of you that can make that as you can. So along that line, we are going through the recruitment process now, trying to find a replacement for David. The ideal scenario for us would be to have an overlap, so that somebody could come in and learn a little bit from him about where he is on some of his key projects. And but we've had a couple of conversations with some people, but our ultimate goal, and when we told this with the two people that we've talked to so far, is that for us it's about the right fit, not necessarily, it might not be the right time, but it'll be the right fit. So if we can't get that overlap, we're not going to rush it just to get a body in there. We're going to make sure that we get the right fit. That is a huge position for us. It's a critical part of what we do. It's a critical part of our executive team, and we're going to make sure that we get somebody in there that continues to build upon what David built for us. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman.
Is there any standardization in rate setting or data books or regional? You say it's our rate, that seems to be like a big deal as the rate setting stuff. It seems like, how different are the rate sets for the ones in the Western Regional, or are they fairly close, or is there any time where they're going to be starting? It seems like that would be like low-hanging fruit to standardize.
Each one of us are independently contracted. We're an individual managed care company contracted with them, so the rates are uniquely set based on what we're doing in our market area. And so there's no standardization. They won't be standardized in that way because they have to treat us as an individual managed care organization.
How close do they end up being? Do you share numbers like that, or is that?
We look at it, it's point of reference, but if I can just give you an example, we talked this afternoon about those rates, our current rates. We currently are noticing that there's an erosion of MST, that's multisystemic therapy. It's a type of therapy that is an important step down service from inpatient care for kids. And we noticed that there's in working with providers, they feel like the rate is not high enough to support that on a long-term basis. So we're talking about how do we increase that. That may be different from what CenterPoint does or any other, or Smoky or any other MCO. But rate setting is a key component of your managed care toolbox. And so that is one of the last things we would give up and want to standardize, because what we would want to emphasize in our catchment area may be different from the challenges that Smoky may have.
But if the Western Regional does happen, then
There'll be one rate.
There would be one rate. If we merged, it would be a single rate.
Another example is what we have already implemented, which is in outpatient therapy. We recognize that we need, again, as a step down from incident, step up to intensive or CST. a need for in-home outpatient therapy service. We think that's a logical additional step in continuing. Well, the outpatient rates don't support the travel to someone's home and the travel back and all that. So we've already, in fact, that goes into effect September 1. We've already done all the due diligence, all the setting up of codes and all that. Now, what that will likely do is drive some providers, drive some business, if you will, toward that. Well, that's different than what's happening in another MCO. We think it's desirable. So they're going to be those kind of different things.
But if it works, others will follow your.
We've already had calls
Yeah.
from others who are interested in how we establish the rate, what a thought process was, that those calls have already come in because other people are kind of going, well, yeah, that makes some sense. Now, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. We think it does.
As long as travel doesn't cost more than providing the inpatient.
Correct. And we've tried to balance, we looked at it from a practical, from an operations point of view, how would this work if you were running a company that had people going out in the field, what numbers do you need to make that work? And so we looked at what is not a unique problem, but we think may in fact be a progressive solution.
Thanks.
First, do you have a question? With other questions for Mr. Melton, we'll move on to item 6, discussion agenda. Turn that over to Mr. Walsh. Could have a presentation for us?
I'm smiling because there's a running challenge as to whether or not a lawyer can cover all the due processes in 10 to 15 minutes. So mark the clock and
16 till.
so let's see if it can be done. For those who have trouble seeing this, please feel free to move up close. For some of those too close, feel free to distance yourself from the attorney.
Just like they have.
Yeah, without invitation. The topic today is the due process. What I want to emphasize is the various different ways that we have of resolving all the different types of disputes that can arise in a managed care organization like ours. Typical, before I go through each of the processes, there's about 4 of them that I'm going to cover today. I wanted to cover some basic law 101 on some of this so you have perspective. For the lawyers on the board, feel free to chastise me privately off the record. The 14th Amendment provides in it that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That applies to the states. It carries over from the 5th Amendment. Basic constitutional law tells us the elements are things that you have to have a government action, no state shall. You have to have a deprivation, and it has to be of life, liberty, or property. This is what a lot of times is referred to as entitlements. If you're entitled to something and that's being taken away from you, then you're entitled to due process. So that's kind of at the heart of a lot of the Medicaid and other types of appeals. What is due process? It's fundamentally notice that something is being done and an opportunity to be heard about it. Now, where it gets really interesting is how much detail. Is it notice before or after the action? Is the opportunity to be heard before or after the action? Is it done in front of a judge, in front of the organization making the decision, in front of a jury? Are you allowed to present evidence? Are you entitled to an attorney? All of those types of details will fill up volumes and do fill up volumes and volumes of law books. The bottom line is that how much notice and how much opportunity to be heard really depends on the entitlement in the circumstances. And there's been a lot of law in the area of managed care organizations and Medicaid that have kind of outlined what they offer us. So, but that's the thing to keep in mind is due process, what kind of notice and what type of opportunity to be heard. Another point on the overall law is that there's a lot, I mean a lot of controlling authorities that we need to comply with. I just mentioned the Constitution. We have to comply with all the federal and state statutes. That includes the American Disabilities Act, the Social Security Act, which actually the Medicaid Act is a subset of the Social Security Act. You guys have heard about the 1915 B and C waiver. Well, Section 1915 is in the Social Security Act and the Medicaid Act. There's a lot of famous cases. All of you have probably heard of the Olmsted case. It basically holds that consumers should be served in their homes and their communities-based services to the extent that it's feasible and can be done. This was originally done many years ago where there was a bad habit of institutionalizing individuals without an analysis of, well, geez, could services be provided to them in the community? So that's really at the heart of a lot of what we do. It's also at the heart of a lot of disputes that we still have to this day. You hear us talk about step downs. You hear us talk about lower levels of care. We're required by law to provide the lowest levels of care in the step downs because it's usually the highest level of integration with the community. We're doing our best to ensure that our consumers are having as much of a life in the entire community as is possible. Those are the broad strokes. We're required to comply with federal and state regulations. That's the North Carolina Administrative Code. The waiver is a type of regulation. Clinical coverage policies are passed by the Department of Health and Human Services, and they spell out the service definitions. There's a misconception out there that we actually do it, that we're like an insurance company that spells out our own insurance plans. That's not true. The state actually defines the service definitions for each of the various services that we offer. They're in the clinical coverage policies. Those are essentially anointed by the federal government through the waivers, and so we then have to comply with them. We have to comply with contracts. We have contracts with DMA, with DMH. We have contracts with all different providers. For those not familiar, DMA is the Medicaid side of DHHS, and DMH is the state side of DHHS. And then we have other things, some of which we've opted to do above and beyond the law. URAC is one of them. They are one of a few accrediting organizations that go in and they go to various parts of your organization and they verify that you are following certain quality control type mechanisms, have certain procedures in place. URAC requires that with our utilization management, with our call center, and with our provider network, thank you. Those 3 areas are URAC certified. And so what you will see as I talk today about some of the due processes, some of them are above and beyond the laws. They're things that we're required to do because of URAC, and they're even more robust. Bottom line, if nothing else you take away today, I say with confidence that we're in full compliance with all the due process. My goal is mostly to kind of assure you what those processes are, because you will hear from various folks, providers, consumers, fellow commissioners, fellow members of CFAC, other organizations about various things that they liked and didn't like. And one of the most important things is that everyone has an opportunity to be heard. They get a notice about the action being taken and an opportunity to say that we're wrong. And for us to truly hear that. And if not us, then move on to other forums. And so that's what I'll talk about today. So one of the things you need to often ask yourself when you hear about these is, did you get your due process? Did you get your opportunity to be heard? Hopefully, and in most instances, we have either been right or when we were wrong, we made changes. We're not perfect. I already kind of talked about the robust. Multi-door, we've made a great effort to ensure there's no wrong way of really getting into these due processes. Or if you've knocked on the wrong door, we don't slam the door on you, we take it and funnel it to the right door. So I like to refer to it as a multi-door. All right, to the heart of the processes. There are essentially 4 dispute types, in my mind, that we have to deal with. 2 of them are consumer related, Medicaid appeals and non-Medicaid appeals. In the consumer-related ones, the entitlement I talked about, the deprivation of life, liberty, or property, is something that the consumer is entitled to. How much they're entitled to it, what the entitlement is, can vary. What you're entitled to through Medicaid versus what you're entitled to through state dollars, what you're entitled to through county dollars can vary. But on the Medicaid appeals, there's a certain process laid on out, and it deals with services that are denied, terminated, suspended, or reduced. So if we partially approve something, that's also a partial denial. There's a due process for that partial denial part. If we terminate, suspended, or reduced service that has already been authorized and hasn't expired, there's a process to deal with that. For non-Medicaid, there are consumer services that are funded by the state, county, and other sources, process for that. Third, there are provider disputes. TNOs are short for tentative notices of overpayment. They're called tentative because overpayments are not final until either a certain number of days have gone by and they haven't appealed, they haven't exercised their due process, or within that time period, I believe it's 30 days, they have appealed, it goes through the process and it's still upheld. So overpayments, or sometimes you hear them called paybacks. It's situations where we have gone ahead and made payments for services that were rendered and it turned out the documents weren't there, the services really weren't rendered, or whatever the circumstances require. Terminations, we have a closed network of providers. We're very careful, as we were talking about, trying to incentivize the right providers for the right parts of our network. So we have those, on occasion, we're having to terminate providers for cause, without cause, depending on circumstances. They have a due process. And then relatives as direct support employees, you've heard a lot about that. Ms. Short talked a little bit about it today. They are actually employees of the provider, and the provider actually has the entitlement to determine who to hire and who not to hire. And so that appeal process goes through the provider disputes. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And then lastly, grievances. Grievances is a catch-all. If you don't have a consumer appeal right through Medicaid or non-Medicaid, if you don't have a provider dispute right through that process, if you're not a consumer or a provider, and you still got a complaint, our grass is too tall, you came visiting and were treated rudely, any type of concerns, you can do it through the grievance process, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So those are the four processes. Let's talk first about consumer Medicaid appeals and actions. They're called actions, which is a term of art. Basically, under the federal regulations, if it's a denial, termination, reduction, suspension of the enrollee, recipient, consumer's services, then it is an action. The reason why that's important is if it's not an action, then it's a grievance. Under Medicaid law, those are the two categories. You either have an action, and if it ain't, then it's a grievance. And if you have an action, it's a much more robust process because it's affecting your services. It's a much more serious entitlement that's being deprived. Tip, if you hear folks talking to you about appeals, reconsiderations, complaints, grievances, resolutions, reviews, disputes, mediation, decisions, recommendations, adverse determinations, and this is just a partial list, there's a very good chance, even if they're an attorney, that they are using it wrong. Because those terms are muddled up in the state law and the federal law. I won't go through a whole lot of it. There's things like what we call reconsideration at the state level is called an appeal at the federal level. What we call an appeal at the state level is called a state fair hearing at the federal level. It gets confusing. So the tip for you is, as you hear folks say, I didn't get a right to do an appeal or something like that, is to really delve in, if you're interested, to find out, well, what exactly was involved and what did you get? Because they may be using the words inappropriately, but the substance is right. With the consumer Medicaid appeals or actions, again, we already talked about services denied, suspended. For each of these four, I've kind of created an up-step process that shows you. The very first thing in a consumer Medicaid appeal is a decision letter goes out, usually called a notice of decision. They may start calling them notices of action because of that federal language. As soon as, and that goes out to both the consumer and the provider, so that everybody knows. In fact, the providers find out a little quicker because they've got an electronic portal that they can access and see, whereas we send it by mail to the consumers. Either one of them, hopefully they talk to each other about it. The denials are based on, the decisions are based on documentation for medical necessity. To keep the slides small, I have MN in there, but that's medical necessity per the state and federal standards I talked about earlier, the clinical coverage policies. 5 days, within about 5 days of receiving or sending of the notice of decision, you can do a peer-to-peer. This is something that's not required by law. This is something that we've incorporated largely through URAC and other procedures. That's why you'll notice I have a dark blue on a lot of things, but this is a light blue because it's optional. A peer-to-peer is basically your doctor talk to our doctor, your clinician talk to our clinician. Let's just get on the phone and find out. Because it could be an assessment's missing, a document's missing, or there's a misunderstanding as to what the definitions require. This is not used as much as we'd like, and we're working hard on trying to get more and more folks to do it because we've gotten really good results from it by just having the subject matter experts talk to each other. In fact, one of the things I discovered recently when I was at a DSS and county attorney conference, is that a lot of them didn't realize it existed. And it's empowering and telling the consumers and the guardians and the others to call up their provider and say, get on the horn and talk. There's a peer-to-peer process. Take advantage of it. There's, I don't have the percentages, but I've heard there's a very low number that actually, even when we reach out, excuse me? 17% that actually take advantage of it. And they're very successful. So, timing, process details are heavily governed. To keep this moving along, I'm not going to go into all the timing, but each of these, generally by federal or state law or by URAC standards, you have to get letters out in certain time periods, you have to do various things in certain time periods. There's then an independent reconsideration. If the consumer is unhappy with a decision, they ask for independent reconsideration, which is another clinician who comes in, looks at the same documents, uninvolved in all the previous matters, and they go ahead and they make their own independent decision. Once that is done, you'll notice all of these are in blue. That's because all of these have been done internally, including the independent reconsideration, even though it's farmed out sometimes to a vendor. It's still us reconsidering our own decision. So we're going through this whole process of, we made a decision, are we going to stick to our decision? We say yes, at which point the consumer now has a right to go to the Office of Administrative Hearings, OAH, with an administrative law judge, and present all their evidence as to why we're wrong. In fact, there's a new evidence rule, it's called new evidence rule, to where if something new has happened between when we made our decision and that hearing, they can still present it. Because the concept isn't who's right or wrong. The concept is the consumer getting the services they need at that point in time. So right up to the day of the hearings, we're sometimes getting the assessment we've been asking for all along. Or something happened to the consumer and they've got a medical issue that complicates things, and now suddenly the service becomes appropriate. There's a mediation process within 10 to 25 days after they do this that allows them to take advantage of the mediation. Not all of them do. I think only about 33% of them actually go to mediation, but we have a very high resolution rate at that. Again, a lot of this, in my opinion, is miscommunications. Folks don't realize there's other services available, or all we need is certain documents. One more opportunity to actually discuss it. If they're unhappy with the resolution from OAH, they then enter, after all this, they then enter the judicial system. They can go to the Superior Court, they can go to the North Carolina Court of Appeals, they can go all the way up to the state Supreme Court, arguing in all of these particular matters. That's essentially the consumer Medicaid approach. That is very similar to the consumer non-Medicaid appeals. Again, this is state, county, and other funds. These are considered more discretionary funds. When we talk about entitlements, these are discretionary. It has been held by law that we have a lot more control and discretion as to how these funds are used, and as a result, the process is a little less formal, and the final decision is actually made by the LME, but it does have an outside touch. The first three steps are the exact same ones I described. Again, by law, we don't necessarily have to do it, but we think for an abundance of being heard and getting noticed, we think they're very good to use on the state side as well. It also provides a little seamlessness, so we follow that as well. Then, instead of going to OAH, the Office of Administrative Hearings, which is part of the state executive branch, we go to the DMH, which is the state arm of DHHS, and they have a hearing officer, and she hears it. And it's very similar to OAH, in some ways different. With OAH, they're almost always by telephone. In DMH, they actually have a hearing officer. She's a JD with a master's in social work, I believe, who goes all around the state hearing these. And she actually shows up in person in the catchment area, so everyone's together in the room, which again is another great opportunity to meet face to face and make sure this isn't just a communication problem. The DMH hearing officer issues a decision, but it's actually really a recommendation. Because the final decision stays with the LME, that decision is then given to the CEO or the area authority director, who then issues a final decision. That final decision can agree with or disagree with, or partially agree or partially disagree with whatever the DMH hearing officer had determined. In every single instance so far where things have gone that far, our CEO has agreed with the DMH hearing officer. We may have expanded on some language or clarified some things, but in every single instance, whatever the decision was by DMH, we've gone along with also. Third process, provider appeals. These are getting much more complex these days, so I've tried to get it down really short. As I said, paybacks, terminations, these are not consumer services. The consumer services have already been approved, so that's not being involved here. This is not also involving which employee gets to do it, or relative as direct support employee getting to do it. This has to do with the provider itself. The provider is enrolled in the Medicaid program. The provider has contract requirements. They've gone through credentialing requirements, and something goes wrong. We've either overpaid them for whatever reason because they don't have the documentations or whatever, so we're asking for money back, or we've terminated them, those types of things. So we give them those notices. They then get a level 1 or level 2 panel. Level 1 and level 2 if they want both. Or they just get an administrative investigation. Essentially what happens is, it's just an administrative matter. If it's a matter about overpayments and documentation, that's generally handled by a staffer internally who issues a decision letter. If, however, it involves clinical problems or a status in the network, for example, you're being terminated or something like that, or certain services you're doing are being terminated but not others, then you get to have a level 1 panel appeal. That panel is a mix of our staff and outside providers and clinicians in the same area specialty. So you're actually, I should probably almost put a little purple on this one because it's a mix of both us and the outside world reviewing that. If you're unhappy with the level 1 panel comes up with, then you get to have a second panel of all new people, starts from scratch, and you get to see it again. Again, this is not required by law. This is something we largely do through URAC. It's above and beyond, and so you won't see this in all MCOs. If you're unhappy with that, then you can go to OAH. There's a legal debate going on throughout the state as to whether everything can go to OAH by the provider or only certain things. I won't bore you with that, but the gist of it is that a lot of them do wind up going to OAH, an administrative law judge. There is a mediation process, there is a hearing, and they do issue a final decision. That final decision represents the final decision on behalf of the state. If they're unhappy with that, they can go through the courts and the judicial system. Grievances, this is just basically the same thing I mentioned earlier. Grievance is everything that is not an action. The confusion is that under federal law, and they even admit it, the overall system is called a grievance system. So appeals and actions are in a grievance system. Again, all you need to do for a takeaway is remember that if they say grievance, if they say appeal, if they say action, they may or may not be using it appropriately. Find out exactly what is going on. And of course, refer them to us. Grievances. All staff are trained to take in grievances. That's one of the very important things. When we onboard folks on a regular basis, we make sure, again, this is the multi-door. It doesn't matter who you call on up. We can take in that grievance. Remember, it can be anyone on almost any subject. The grievance is lodged. Whoever takes it in puts it into the computer system. We have people responsible then for making sure that grievance is properly vetted through the system. They acknowledge it with a letter, usually within 5 days, to whoever it is. It's often a consumer, but it could be consumer, provider, or anybody. We acknowledge it with a letter. It is assigned to the appropriate person or people within our organization. If it deals with providers, it's probably going to be somebody on the provider network. If it's going to be consumers, it's probably somebody on consumer relations. If it's rudeness by an employee, it may well be HR. It just depends on the nature of the grievance. There's an investigation done and a decision made and a letter is issued. And all of this is done on a strict timeline set by laws and regulations. We then have another panel review like we do with some of the others. This one I did wisely put a little purple around the blue because it's a mix. The panel is both staff plus Consumer and Human Rights Committee members. So that again, while it's still internal, we're still deciding on our own whether we've done the right thing or the wrong thing. We're bringing in outsiders to help us make that decision and keep us on the right course. And then finally, the panel review issues their recommendation to the CEO, who then issues a final decision, much like we do with the DMH hearings. We have yet to have a situation where the panel said one thing and the CEO said another. It's basically whatever they decide to reduce to writing, send out in a letter and send to the consumer. The one thing that is a little bit different is by state law for grievances, that's the end of the process. They can call DMH, they can call DMA, and they can complain. And the state, as our overseers, can call us on up and say what's going on. But as far as a formal appeal or grievance process, that's the end of the line. Those are the 4 processes. I had on your questions, but I did not make the timeline, so I retract the question off. I am available, though, to talk to folks offline later about any of this. But it was so exciting, you didn't notice I was over time, right?
Depends on who you are.
Ask questions. See if that was right.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh, for that enlightening presentation. I don't know why I determined the reputation was up there, but
Give me a timeline, I'll just go fast.
Are they not going to ask any
moving
questions?
down to item number B.
Wow.
I did point out that we have new appointments for the Finance Committee for the 14-15 year. Robert Anderson from Surrey County, Ann Petit for Gaston County, and Frank Zachary for Yakin County. Appreciate those people serving on Finance Committee. I think this is a total of 7 members on that committee. Do a good job for us. Also, I think you will pass out, you've got a list of those committees. With each of them.
Funny, huh?
Also, I think you had placed a updated list of everybody's terms. Needs asked if you'll please look at that, make sure your personal information is correct, that numbers or emails or something hasn't been changed on that. Please let her know so she can make those corrections. Good way to read it.
I know, they're funny, huh?
Take it off the screen, take it off the far end. I think that's one you use, but it's not on the list.
All right, our next regular scheduled meeting, the September 18th at 6 p.m. In the old purpose room here in 3. Any other business?
Motion to adjourn?
Back to normal.